Hi, this is Dark Journalist. Today I have an exciting show for you. We're going to be joined by Oxford scholar and Giza Death Star book series author Dr. Joseph Farrell. Now we're going to be going over extreme breakthroughs on Antarctica, the Nazi Bell, and Hess doubles, along with unusual occult groups operating before, during, and after the Third Reich. Now we'll draw heavily on Dr. Farrell's classic titles Hess and the Penguins and SS Brotherhood of the Bell. Is there a trail of advanced technology that a post-war fascist group has kept hidden for decades? Let's go ask Dr. Joseph Farrell. Joseph, it's fantastic to have you back with us.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Now, your innovative work on the Nazi International and the Antarctica mystery is really breaking new boundaries and giving us a much better understanding of how these mysteries impact the current geopolitical situation. Now, one of the major chapters in this book of secrecy is the Hess mystery, or as you call it, the Hess mess.
Yes.
Now, Joseph, what is the Hess mess?
Well, the Hess mess is literally all of the stuff surrounding Rudolf Hess and his flight to Great Britain in May of 1941, and then everything that results from that up to the very end of his or somebody else's life in August of 1987. And that's the problem, because most researchers into the mess, as I call it, think that at some point during his stay in Great Britain, and I happen to think this too, although I leave the question open in the book, because you can make an arguable case that that was the real Hess. The problem is there's so much ambiguity from 1941 that you might be dealing with one or the other person. Mm-hmm. That in itself makes every feature that you have to examine, it puts it into a double light. Mm-hmm. And then, given the fact that every feature that you're examining is itself ambiguous, you're dealing with a hall of mirrors. Mm-hmm. So it is a mess. I call it the Hess mess for a reason, because it really requires you to interpret almost everything that you're dealing with in two ways, and at a minimum. And in that sense, it's probably the biggest unsolved mystery of the 20th century. I mean, it's right up there with JFK. Mm-hmm. And in fact, between the two, I think the Hess thing is much more significant because of what I think he may have been up to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which was anything but small. But anyway, yeah.
That's saying a lot.
Yeah, that's saying a lot. If it's bigger than JFK, and I think it is. I have a quotation in the book from one of the researchers I studied that, for very good reason, academics leave it alone because it's a mess.
Right.
What are you going to do with this guy?
Yeah.
A sort of a nice Nazi. Whatever that means.
Right.
The kinder, gentler Gestapo. But anyway. No, the whole thing, that the man himself, the real Hess, is an ambiguity in a certain sense, because prior to his flight, he was, the number 3 man in Nazi Germany, number 2 behind Hitler within the Nazi Party, which made him extraordinarily powerful. Mm-hmm. He was definitely, if you can put these two words together, he was kind of a cosmopolitan Nazi. Right.
Yeah. Good going. You don't see those together very often.
No, you don't see those two together very often. But by that, I mean, he's multilingual. He speaks Arabic, enough to be conversational in it. He speaks French conversationally. He speaks English conversationally. So he's a multilingual man. He was born in Alexandria, Egypt, in the German quarter of Alexandria. So he's got this fascination with Egypt and history and occult lore and stuff like that. His family is kind of upper middle class, so he goes off to the École Supérieure, in Switzerland to study business. So yeah, this guy is not your average Nazi bigwig. And in some estimates at that time, this is what's so very peculiar, at that time, there were people in America, and there were even articles in Foreign Relations, the Council on Foreign Relations magazine, its Foreign Affairs, were writing articles about Hess really being kind of the brains of the operation, not Hitler. Um, so prior to his flight in May of 1941, Nazi propaganda was extolling. I mean, they were paying him a lot of attention, in fact, more than usual, which is kind of part of the story. After his flight, I mean, this changes literally overnight. Within 24 hours, the guy's off his rocker. He's nuts. He's insane. That's the Nazis.
Wow.
Saying this.
Yeah, they're saying, oh, he's having hallucinations.
Yeah, he's having hallucinations. He was, he wasn't doing too well and consulting with astrologers. And of course, that was a big propaganda blunder because, here we're admitting that one of our major leaders is nuts. But he wasn't nuts.
Right.
And that's the thing. He wasn't nuts at all. He was, you've got that ambiguity about him. And then you've got the ambiguity that he apparently was morally conflicted about aspects of the Hitler regime that began to manifest itself. You've got him involved in the Night of the Long Knives, when Hitler turned against the SA, the Sturmabteilung, and was liquidating the SA leaders, including Ernst Röhm. And Hess, pressed Hitler to go ahead and take out the SA. So, his hands are in that whole mess. But at the same time, people heard Hess arguing with Hitler, behind closed doors, take this person off the death list and that person and so on. And after this point, the Night of the Long Knives, people observe that his signature changes. He begins to suffer the stomach pains and gastrointestinal troubles from that point. So in other words, you've got kind of a psychosomatic response to things. And then during the Reichskristallnacht, the Crystal Night,
that's 1938.
That's 1938, the pogrom against the Jews. Hess, was horrified, according to some sources, that this was going on, and was again trying to persuade Hitler to tone this down, back off. This. And the peculiar thing again is that Hess was involved with the famous German geopolitician Karl Haushofer. He had studied under him at the University of Munich after World War I. And of course, Haushofer's wife is half Jewish. So, he's got personal relationships that are Jews. And, again, he's trying to protect them and so on and so forth. So he's morally conflicted. But at the same time, to add more to the personal conflict of the man, when he and Hitler are in Landsberg prison after the beer hall putsch in 1923, Hess actually helps Hitler. In fact, their friendship becomes so familiar, so intimate, that they're using the German informal address with each other. Hitler is calling Hess by a diminutive expression in German that actually would indicate affection. Hesserl, he calls him, and Hess in turn is addressing Hitler as Du. In other words, a familiar friend. And then you have Hess. It's popularly well known, that Hess supposedly took the dictation for Hitler when Hitler was dictating Mein Kampf. The reality, if you dig a little further, is that General Haushofer, again, who maintained contact with Hess and Hitler when they were both in prison, Haushofer and some of the immediate people in Hess's circle came out, including an American, incidentally, came out and said, no, Hess wrote many of those passages in Mein Kampf, and particularly the lucid ones.
Right. Well, it's interesting because it's a very well written book in certain ways. You know, you have this like could be with that good education coming
Right.
from good, you know,
Right.
status in his family. He got that education. He was able to translate Hitler's ideas into this
Right.
format. Definitely.
Yeah, at least the passages in Mein Kampf on the Nazi Party, its philosophy, and the passages on geopolitics, the chapters on geopolitics, those were directly from Hess. In other words, Hess wrote those.
Hmm.
Hitler didn't write those. And the final thing that most people are not aware of, Hitler's original title for the book was something awful like, 4 years of conflict and turmoil and struggle against the biggest lie in the world, or,
Right.
some long thing that made no sense. It was Hess that gave the book the title, Mein Kampf. So in other words, he's very influential. He literally is kind of the brains of this whole operation. And so you've got this, in addition to all the other problems in the Hess mess of doubles and so on, which I'm sure we'll get into eventually. But in addition to all that, you've got a morally conflicted man. The real Hess is a morally conflicted man because he's beginning to see the regime go in directions that, to him, middle class German Lutheran, are abhorrent. So the problem here with Hess is also that he writes an essay when he's at the University of Munich studying with General Haushofer. He writes an essay on the future leader of Germany, in which he points out that this leader is going to have to be ruthless and strong, to get the country back on its feet. But then he goes on and says, but it may become necessary for the good of the country for that leader to step aside.
Wow.
Yeah. So in other words, even then, he's thinking, yeah, we've got to clamp down, but after we clamp down, then we've got to shuffle that guy off the side and lighten up a bit.
That's interesting.
It's very interesting, yeah, and especially given what I think he was up to.
Right, right. Well, you've got it's incredibly like he has a lot of political dynamics. He understands in a way that like a lot of the Nazis really don't. They're very,
Right.
They're there to make things happen. And I would say, especially early on, Hitler didn't have good political sense.
Oh no.
Yeah, he definitely was the target of the newspapers, and he was kind of
Right.
laughing stock.
Well, Hitler not only didn't have good political sense, he was a lower class Austrian, to be blunt about it, and it's really Hess and Haushofer that kind of train him in the manners and etiquette that he's going to need to move in high places and meet highly placed and influential people. So again, Hess is exerting an enormous influence. And the final thing we need to note about Hess, when the Nazis take power, Hess is designated the Stellvertreter. In the term is a very, very strong German term. It's usually translated deputy Führer, but to give the full force of it, it's kind of like being a papal nuncio or an Ottoman Grand Vizier. In other words, he's the personal representative of Adolf Hitler in the Nazi Party, since Hitler's now taken over, the function of Reichschancellor and so on. Hess becomes Hitler's stand-in in the Nazi Party, which places him in control of all of that vast Nazi Party machinery, its intelligence organizations, both foreign and domestic. It puts him in control of the appointment of bureaucrats in the Nazi state. Every piece of legislation that is decreed by Hitler has to have Hess's co-signature on it. So in other words, he's a very powerful man. In the Nazi state. And, to get a measure of the power, when he takes over the Nazi Party apparatus, one of the people he spots, his eyes fall on this individual as having some talent is Martin Bormann. So it's actually Hess, again, that promotes Martin Bormann to be his personal secretary. And of course, once Hess flies off to Britain, Bormann essentially takes over all of Hess's role and, of course, basically rules Nazi Germany behind the scenes. Hitler's running his war, but Bormann's running the country.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives you an idea of Hess's power prior to his flight to Great Britain, because he's in charge of the very same apparatus that Bormann is. So he's an immensely powerful man. There's just no way to short circuit this. Anything that's going on in Nazi Germany prior to his flight, he's going to know about.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the contextual argument for his involvement in Antarctica. There are other direct things that indicate it, but that's the contextual argument for it. So in spite of what academics are saying, well, there's no evidence that he was involved with that, well, baloney. Nothing takes place in Nazi Germany without him knowing about it. So he's going to know about it simply because of his position. I think that there are other factors that would indicate that he's going to have a direct personal interest, in that while we do not know whether Hitler was ever involved as a member formally of the Thule Gesellschaft, that interwar kind of proto-Nazi secret society in Munich, Hess was a member.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the doctrine of the Thule Society was, of course, this idea that the Aryans came from off-planet and landed here on planet Earth at the poles.
Right.
So, Hess is going to have a natural personal interest in that Antarctica expedition. So, again, I think the contextual argument there is ironclad, but there's a significant detail that we'll probably get into later once we start discussing what the real Hess mess is, what's at the center of it. There's a significant detail that ties him to Antarctica.
Okay, so that's where we'll go next, so this major Nazi technology connection to Antarctica. Now, you and I did an episode on Admiral Byrd's famous expeditions to Antarctica, most notably Operation High Jump, where he apparently witnessed a fleet of flying discs that terrified him and his crew. And that episode got a huge response. Now, we do know before World War II that Byrd was asked by the Nazis to give them a major briefing, an overview, and act as a consultant for their Antarctica expedition. Now, my question is, who was it that was behind this Nazi Antarctica expedition?
Oh, Hermann Goering again, sponsored
okay.
the Nazi Antarctic expedition. That was Hermann Goering that did that. He placed a trusted confidant of his, a fellow by the name of Helmut Voltat, to organize the expedition. We'll get back to Helmut here in a minute, folks, to organize the expedition. So the German expedition goes to Antarctica, flies over, takes, their photo reconnaissance pictures, plants their little swastikas, and goes back to Germany. And the captain of the expedition, Alfred Ritschl, is sent a telegram by Hermann Goering congratulating him on fine work done for the greater future, glorious future of German science industry and Germany's position in the world, something to that effect. And I'm thinking, okay, Herman, that's an interesting statement to make. And Ritschl is surprised because the Norwegian king and parliament had sent a letter, a diplomatic note to Germany, protesting the German claim to Neuschwabenland. And the German foreign ministry at that time, under Joachim von Ribbentrop, next to Hess at Nuremberg, had replied that no, the Norwegian claim is vacated for two reasons. Number one, you haven't done anything with the area since you claimed it. And number two, we explored a much larger area than you, and we're laying claim to that larger area. So in other words, there is a dispute over sovereign claims in Antarctica between Germany and Norway. So I strongly suspect, that when Churchill sends the emissary to Hess and makes inquiries about Norway, that Norway is code not only for the country, but all of its claimed regions, namely Antarctica.
Oh.
What he's asking about is, where does Antarctica fit in here, and what are you going to cut us a deal with? That's what he's really asking. So in other words, as part of the Hess mess, I think that as they're negotiating about spheres of influence, everybody's eye is on Antarctica for one very important reason. That whole continent is resource rich.
Mm-hmm.
The Brits have the Navy to exploit it, and the Germans have the science.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it's fascinating because we did the episode on Antarctica, and we know that they actually got Byrd to show them how to get into Antarctica and what to do there. So they had a lot of the inside detail.
Well, yeah, we'll get back to Byrd. I mentioned Helmut Voltat, the man that Hermann Goering puts in actual de facto charge of organizing the Antarctic expedition. But guess what? As Helmut Voltat is doing this, he's also Goering's personal emissary in peace negotiations prior to the war breaking out with the British via his contact in the International Whaling Industry Association or some such body. So in other words, the very guy that Hermann Goering puts in charge of Antarctica is also the same guy he's using as point man in these late pre-war peace negotiations with the British.
That's really interesting.
That's, yeah, add it all together. I think what Hess was also doing was they were literally in their peace negotiations carving up the world into spheres of influence, and top of the list was Antarctica.
Interesting. Yeah. And you're thinking it's resources. It makes sense, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
However, I do think it's entirely possible that the Germans, in doing their photogrammetry flights over Neuschwabenland and mapping it, that they may have found or seen something that has not been disclosed to this day. Because, and the reason I say that is because when Admiral Byrd goes down there so quickly after the war, and this is yet another big piece of debris in this whole mess, is that Admiral Byrd, as we know, was outfitted for 8 months stay. He only stayed a few weeks. And he lands everywhere in Antarctica except where the Germans landed in 1938 and 39.
Right.
And then he uses, in the big National Geographic article that he publishes after High Jump, which I think was a cover piece, and I'll get into why in a minute, but he talks about encircling the enemy and advancing on 3 fronts, something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at that phrase and I'm wondering why the military terms for an expedition supposedly that has nothing but a scientific and operational purpose. The operational purpose that we've been told publicly by the United States government was that, well, we knew the next theater of war was likely going to be the Arctic, so we needed to test our equipment and our tactics and our training. And I'm thinking, we've got Alaska and we've got Canada. Why do you need to go 8,500 miles south with a fleet to test equipment that you can do much more cheaply up there?
Yeah.
So I think it's a cover story. And the reason I think it's a cover story is due to the people involved in planning Operation High Jump with Admiral Byrd. People like Fleet Admiral Nimitz. Okay.
Yeah.
And Secretary of the Navy, here it comes, James Forrestal.
Forrestal, the ultimate insider who knows what it's about. And he's the key point man on the UFO file. In fact, it's his deep knowledge of the UFO file that will cause his untimely death.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating because, how can I put this? Just like the Hess case, nothing about Antarctica makes any sense.
No, nothing about it does. And the fact that Hess is lurking in the middle of it, and that this is very probably a subject of this secret conversation between Churchill and Hess, really makes you stop and wonder. really makes you stop and wonder. There's something about all this that has not come out to this day. I'm quite convinced of this.
I want to rope in something for a second from your other research into this, and you could tell me if
Mhm.
it fits or not.
Sure.
But do you think any of this secrecy around Hess could have related to the bell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the reason why is very simple. He's the Reich Commissar for all technological matters in the Third Reich. So, in other words, there's not a black project prior to 1941 that Hess does not know about. And there's every indication that the Bell is a project underway by that time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not a project that he's not going to know about. And let's not forget one of his positions of authority within the Third Reich was that he was also an SS general. So in other words, as all the Nazi hierarchy were, he's plugged into the very top of that entity, which is ultimately going to end up controlling all of the black projects in the Third Reich. So he knows literally everything that's going on.
Yeah.
Without exception. And I do think that this is one reason that perhaps he, for a period of time in Great Britain, was drugged. And if you read some of his statements that are in the book, he actually states that he played along with them and was, feigning to give answers that he thought that they wanted him to give. But I didn't spill anything. Basically, is what he comes down to say.
Mm-hmm.
So again, there's every indication that the British were looking for something, that even Churchill at one point may have been involved in trying to find out what's going on with German plans in Antarctica and so on, or he was trying to find out the full scope of this negotiation that Hess came to conduct with members of the royal family and the British peerage. So again, all of this is adding up to a whopper doozy of a huge question squatting in the middle of it all. I don't think anybody has the overall answer. What we have are suggestions, and I even put it that way in the book.
Yeah, well, I can totally appreciate that. I just think it's interesting because Hess dies in prison, is it 1987?
1987. Mm-hmm.
And the Bell stuff comes up in a trial in the early 90s. That's how we know about it, right?
Yes, the Bell stuff comes up in a Polish war crimes trial, according to Igor Witkowski, in 1946. And it's largely in the testimony or affidavit of an SS General Jakob Sporenberg. And the reason he's brought up to trial is that in his affidavit, he admits to being ordered to murder, on the orders of the SS, namely General Kammler, murder 60 of the scientists supposedly that had been working on it. Now, yeah, subsequently, Igor, and this is not well known, published later editions of his book in which he maintained that there's possible indication that Sporenberg was not the person executed by the Poles, that the Russians, again, pulled another switcheroo, and the Poles executed somebody else, and Sporenberg ended up in the Soviet Union. So,
Yeah,
this is just so...
Well, this is how it rolls at the end of the war, though. It's
it is.
Anybody's
it really
game.
Is.
Just like we know with Bormann, he died how many different times?
So. At least 8.
Yeah. That's the way it went. But that is fascinating because I find that the secrecy around the Bell and the fact that we didn't know about it and the fact that he would have known about those projects at least is a hint of a suggestion that maybe the Bell had something to do with the secrecy around Hess.
We know that Hess knew about a lot of these black projects, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
If you recall my chapter on the actual aircraft, the Messerschmitt 110, the twin-engine aircraft that he flew, and the research of some British authors here has really been first-rate, because they point out that even with the drop tanks that Hess had Willy Messerschmitt fit to that aircraft, he still would have had to have stopped to refuel.
Hmm.
So remember the flight path from Augsburg up to Frisia in the North Sea, he would have gone right over Göttingen, where they say, in all probability, he stopped to refuel. And when they said Göttingen, I thought, what? Because Göttingen was where the Horton brothers were producing their first designs for a flying wing.
Right.
And they both end up, of course, in Argentina, working for Juan Perón, and get mentioned in Brigadier General Charles Shulgin's intelligence collection memorandum in September of 1947 after the Roswell incident, which, of course, the ufologists love to point to that document and say, see here, it was all extraterrestrial. When you read Shulgin himself in the memorandum, he's wanting to know where the Horton brothers are. So,
right.
What do they have to do with extraterrestrial UFOs? So, yeah, Hess, according to their scenario, and I think it's very likely, because of his stature as Reich Commissar of all technological projects, well, if he's going to get people involved in his plot, how do you keep it compartmentalized? Use the Black Projects people. Use the Horton brothers and their facilities. So,
wow. Yeah, it is. It's fascinating.
Yep.
It starts to add up there, too, and you have to think in terms of, like, the whole war aspect of it. You know, they'd be thinking of the advanced technology part.
Yep.
No question.
So, yeah, there's a big secret squatting in the middle of this Hess mess. And one of the most interesting aspects of this is that Wolf Rüdiger Hess uncovered, and again, he doesn't produce any documentation for this, but he mentions it in his book, and I mention it in mine because, again, it might be part of this aspect of the Hess mess. He mentions that when Menachem Begin met with President Carter and Anwar Sadat in the Camp David meetings that led to the Accords, that Menachem Begin allegedly pulled Carter aside and told Carter Hess must never leave prison.
Wow. Well, let's take a look at why by going back to his strange mission of parachuting into Scotland to get a truce. Of course, we know he chose a date for this mission with astrologers and psychics. So he's using esoteric means to get the peace plan to happen. In fact, he's adorned with some magical symbols. So what else is going on in May of 1941, just previous to this bizarre flight?
Well, in May of 1941, the Blitz, the air campaign against England, the bombing campaign, reaches its absolute zenith. And in fact, on the day that Hess is flying to Great Britain, London is being pounded by the Luftwaffe in the biggest bombing raid that it had launched to that point. So that's going on. But the big thing is that Hitler has now swept into the Balkans, of course, and kicked the British out of Greece. He's conquered Yugoslavia. He's lined up Romania and Bulgaria with the Axis. And he's making the final preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union to follow about a month and a half later. And Hess, the important thing about Hess, and as we're going to see Hermann Goering, is they do not think that invading the Soviet Union so long as Britain is still in the war is a good idea. Well, duh.
Right.
But, the way they're looking at it, Goering is the practical military man, and he's thinking, okay, how am I going to, keep my Luftwaffe able to handle the RAF and the Red Air Force? And we're looking down the pike at clear indications of an eventual American entry into the war. And so long as Britain is in the war, that gives America easy access to forward bases. If Britain's out of the war, then America can build and, produce all at once, and it's going to be a very difficult proposition to get it over there into Europe to do anything significant. So the way that Hess is looking at this, we've got to get Britain out of the war, conclude a peace with Britain, and then, take on the Soviet Union. That's the way he's thinking about this. And in fact, if you look at what he's up to, he immediately begins, after the war is started, he immediately begins peace feelers with Great Britain, as does Hermann Goering.
Oh, yeah.
Which again is bizarre. I point out in the book that Goering, right up to the point that World War II breaks out, Goering is involved in very quiet peace negotiations with the British, trying to prevent this war.
Wow.
So, and Hess is too. And, that's a little indicator right there, I think, as a significant clue what the Hess mess is. Both of these men, Goering is the number 2 man in the state. He is Adolf Hitler's successor to the offices of state. Right. Hess is Adolf Hitler's successor in the offices of the party. So you've got the second man in the state and the second man in the party, both initiating peace negotiations prior to the outbreak of World War II and continuing those negotiations after it breaks out. So that's the first little clue that there's something going on here behind the scenes with these 2 men. Mm-hmm. Most researchers do not couple their efforts to each other because the academic line is that Hess and Goering were rivals, and therefore, they were each doing their own private little thing. I think that's nonsense.
Yeah. They're always like, oh, they were cutting Hess out, and like Himmler and Goering were plotting against him or whatever.
Right. Yeah. No, I don't think that's the case. These are Nazis, after all, guys. They're not going to be stupid about this. Yeah. Whatever else one says about them, they're not going to be stupid about it. So that's what's going on in May of 1941. And the other final thing we need to mention is that in my research, I uncovered something that Picknett, Prince, and Pryor mentioned in their research, and I was dumbfounded when I read this, that President Roosevelt was at the same time preparing some sort of big speech that he was going to give to the Congress or Organization of American States, every head of state from Latin America and North America. And the scuttlebutt around Washington from people that were very closely associated with President Roosevelt was that he was going to propose in his speech, propose an actual fusion of the United States and Great Britain. In other words, let's just make them one country.
Wow.
Okay. Now, harebrained as that sounds, imagine if you're Hermann Goering or Rudolf Hess or Reinhard Heydrich or Heinrich Himmler, and you get wind that Roosevelt might do this. Well, that's got to be prevented at all costs. So think of it this way. If you believe nothing else about what I'm going to tell you, what I think the Hess mess is, at the minimum, his flight to Great Britain, his mere flight and presence in Great Britain cancels any possibility of that deal happening. Why? Because it's going to look like Churchill is double dealing.
Right.
So in other words, it becomes in a certain sense for this group in Nazi Germany that's trying to end the war in the West so that they can go take out Stalin. It becomes an absolute strategic necessity, a diplomatic necessity for them to go ahead with this. So that's looming in the background of the Hess mess. That's just one of the little things. It's a mess. There's no other way to qualify.
Well, that is fascinating, though. Hess realizes this is the time I have to take action.
Right.
I have to basically do what Hitler can't do.
Right.
How about the idea that Hitler knew of and supported the mission?
Okay, this is where we're going to start unpeeling the layers of the Hess mess. The first thing you have to understand is every indication is there when you study the details of how long Hess had been negotiating quietly through Haushofer's contacts in Great Britain, which included people in the peerage. This is very important. included people in the peerage and people in the city of London that were also opposed to continuing the war.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So in other words, there's a British peace party and there's a German peace party that apparently includes Rudolf Hess and Hermann Goering.
And would you say the British Peace Party includes the Royals?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll definitely get there. So Hess has been conducting these negotiations since the war begins with his British counterparts. Okay? And by the time he flies to Britain, the way that most people view it is that he's flying there to negotiate with the British. Wrong. He's flying there to seal a deal that has already been negotiated. And there's every indication that he prepared an actual draft treaty proposal that he either brought with him or that was, believe this or not, subsequently flown into Great Britain by a Luftwaffe plane, landed in a British airfield. They salute each other, and the German hands the Brit, a big fat document and flies back to Germany.
Fascinating.
Okay,
Yeah.
I told you this was a mess.
Yeah. This makes a lot more sense, though.
Oh, yeah. Now, your question, did Hitler know about it? Yes. There's every indication that Hitler knew about it. What I think happened was that Hess and Goering, in order to make their scheme work, had to bring Hitler in on at least part of it. The part they didn't tell him was that as part of the deal with the Brits, we got to get rid of you.
Oh.
So in other words, the peace mission was also a coup d'etat mission. Okay? Now, if that sounds nonsensical, I go back to what I've said before. What better colonel's plot could you have than to have the number two man in succession to the state and the number two man in succession to the party involved in that plot?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know Goering was involved at some point because there's two little details that people forget. Hess flew from Augsburg, Germany on Saturday, May 10th, 1941 in a Messerschmitt 110, flew northwestward through the Rhineland. And to do this, he would have had to have had maps of the Luftwaffe air defense zones, and he would have had to have the cooperation of the Luftwaffe not to shoot him down. Unauthorized flight here, guys.
Definitely.
So, in other words, if he's not being shot down by the Luftwaffe on an unauthorized flight, this means somebody in the Luftwaffe knows. Plus, he's been given maps. This is the key point. He's been given maps, and we'll get back to who gave him the maps because that's a stunner too. He's been given maps of the air defense zones and the radio beacon direction finding signals that the Luftwaffe uses to send its bombers into Great Britain and into Scotland. So he's got this map marked up with all of this detail. Now, who gives him the map? Well, it just happens to be Hans Bauer. Who's Hans Bauer? Hans Bauer is Adolf Hitler's personal pilot.
Wow.
So in other words, who is also a Luftwaffe general. So at least the maps had to have come from someone in the Luftwaffe telling General Bauer, hey, it's okay to give him those maps. And that can only be one of two people, Hitler himself or Hermann Goering.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason I think it was Hermann Goering brings us to the next strange little detail in the Hess mess. As Hess is flying to Scotland, he's flying to Scotland, and all of a sudden, General Adolf Galland, who's the Luftwaffe general in charge of the air defenses of Western Europe, okay, Adolf Galland gets a call from, guess who? Reichsmarschall Goering. And Goering says, you've got to scramble planes right away. And Gollum says, well, why? There's nothing on the radar. They're not sending anything in. And Goering loses it. And he says, I'm not talking about shooting down anything coming in. It's something going out. It's the deputy Fuhrer. He's lost his mind. Shoot him down. Now, what that means is Goering knows. Mm-hmm. Number one, that means he knows. Well, the question is, how does he know? Mm-hmm. Okay, and his behavior is even more important here because the day after Hess is gone, he pretends not to have known anything about it when Hitler demands to see him at Berchtesgaden. Now, the timing of Goering's call to General Galland is very interesting because Goering calls him after it's feasible to shoot Hess down. Uh-huh. So in other words, Galland is wondering, well, if that's so, Herr Reichsmarschall, he's, miles ahead of us. There's no way we'll catch up with him. But he goes ahead and scrambles, a couple of units. And of course, they don't find Hess. But Goering has covered his big plump, what.
He wanted the cover story. He didn't really want to take him down.
He didn't want to take him down, but he wanted the cover story in case something went wrong. Right. And that tells me that Goering is involved in this plot.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, now, when I don't even remember what your original question is. I'm just this is just such a bizarre mess that. I mean, this is like something Hollywood would have cooked up.
No, it's good. We started with was Hitler aware, and you brought us into the full arc of it, and that is fascinating because now we're getting to how he actually got out through those air defenses, and I guess you would think on the other end also there's an agreement not to shoot him down.
Yeah, well, this is where it gets even more interesting. Because, of course, the RAF is tracking Hess's plane on radar. And you've got a German plane coming in. This could be the, pathfinding bomber for a bombing raid. So what do? Well, they scramble one fighter. Okay. And there are already, wait a minute. One Spitfire against a squadron of Luftwaffe bombers. Yeah, right. It's not going to cut it, folks. I'm sorry. And they've got 4 Polish fighters already in the air. And they scramble this guy. He goes up, and he's told to look for this plane. In the meantime, Hess dives. So, the Spitfire is 15,000 feet above Hess. And then on top of this, at one point, another fighter that's scrambled later is told to stand down. Don't shoot it down. So in other words, the response of the RAF to Hess coming in is so completely lackluster that either the British military has become momentarily incompetent and taken leave of its senses, or there's somebody on the British side that's expecting him.
Yes.
And this is where it gets even more interesting. Because Hess, when he actually parachutes into Britain, demands to be taken to the Duke of Hamilton over and over and over. And I go into this in the book, there are these little exchanges between Hess and his British captors, 2 conversations about beer. And I think Picknett and Prince and Pryor get this right. This is code. If you're going to have a plan this elaborate, you have to have a backup plan in case something goes wrong. So how do you recognize your allies on the British side? So there's a code that's established. So Hess is having these very, very strange conversations about beer in English with the British. And he keeps demanding to be taken to see the Duke of Hamilton. He's here on a mission to see the Duke of Hamilton. And then, as he becomes aware of the fact that they're not just going to rush him to see the Duke of Hamilton, he changes his tune. He says, "I've come here under a flag of truce from the king."
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So in other words, again, this, wow. Okay, which of course the king has the power to do.
Yes.
So, long story short here, Daniel, what Hess was negotiating with on the British side were, number one, people within the royal family, the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, the Duke of Hamilton, the Duke of Kent, and through them, of course, the Duke of Kent being the king's younger brother, through them, of course, trying to get to the king. Well, why is he trying to get to the king? Well, prior to his flight, Hess had made a deep study of the British Constitution. And the reason why he was doing this, I think, and I think the thesis of Picknett and Prince and Prior here is correct, that the king could conceivably dismiss Churchill and the Churchill government. Now, this is key because in all prior contacts between Hess and the German Peace Party and the British and their Peace Party, there were two conditions. The British made it clear that, yeah, we would like to end this war, but we won't do it as long as Hitler's in power. And on the German side, it was, we won't do it as long as Churchill's in power.
Right.
So the peace mission now becomes not just a coup d'etat plot against Hitler, it becomes a coup d'etat plot against Churchill.
Remove them both.
Remove them both, which the king could have done. Okay, just simply dismiss the government. And Hess is trying to get, therefore, once he's in Britain, he's trying to get to see the king, constantly trying to get to see the king. Now, here's another mess in the Hess mess, another detail that makes it a mess. Hess was well known in that time. He was in every French, German, Italian, Russian, British, American, and Canadian newsreel. If you see this guy, oh, it's Hess.
Mm-hmm.
When he parachutes into Britain, nobody seems to recognize him. Oh, yeah, he's got a passing resemblance to Rudolf Hess, until somebody, finally, a Polish officer, oh, it's Rudolf Hess.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's right here.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets.
There's a charade taking place.
The charade. You're telling me the initial contact with the British farmer and the soldiers that come to pick him up and cart him off to the POW camp because he's dressed in the uniform of a Luftwaffe captain. Okay. So you're telling me that they can't look at this guy and say, "Oh, it's
the deputy Führer."
It's the deputy Führer. It's just parachuted in. So there's something wrong with the story. I mean, right from the outset on the British side. There's just no two ways about this, Daniel. There is something dramatically and deeply wrong with it.
It's an incredible story, and it makes history ring with this loud echo of a missing chapter there. What was really happening? We're going to explore that in part 2 and find out how the Vril Society, Antarctica, and the Bell all combine for a major occult aspect as Germany becomes the arena for a massive magic experiment. Now, Dark Journalist subscribers will get part 2 in their inbox next week. You don't want to miss this astonishing 90-minute episode coming up. If you're not a subscriber, now is the time. Go to darkjournalist.com and become a member. Now you can find Dr. Farrell's incredible Hess Antarctica book and SS Brotherhood of the Bell. I highly recommend it at gizadeathstar.com. Joseph, just incredible information. Thank you for joining us. Now we'll be back next Friday, October 25th, and we'll be doing X Series episode part 70. Get your space helmets on. And see you soon. Thank you for joining me for this fascinating episode on Hess, Antarctica Mysteries, and the Nazi Bell with Oxford scholar Dr. Joseph Farrell. You can find more special reports, deep interviews, and documentaries at darkjournalist.com. You can also subscribe here to our YouTube channel to receive the latest videos. See you soon.